So this video is on racism in America, and I'm going to be focusing on the Civil War because it was such a huge like landmark for racism in America, and it's kind of how all of the underlying racist sentiment came to fruition and really became a huge issue for the American people. So oftentimes in conversations about the Civil War, you'll hear people say, oh, but the war was over states' rights, hence the Confederate flags you still see some places. Um, and I think John Green said it best in his Crash Course series when they say, oh, but the war was just over states' rights. The question is, a state's right to do what? And John, in his video, John Green, allowed his audience to infer the answer to this question, but I'll spell it out. The Civil War was about states' rights, the state's right to exploit and abuse a group of people based on their skin color, and reap the economic benefits from that. So one video from Oversimplified, a YouTube channel, said that Thomas Jefferson originally wrote a direct condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but it was removed in order to avoid losing Southern support. So essentially, Thomas Jefferson originally wanted to just say from the beginning, slavery isn't something we support in this country, but that would have lost like half the country's vote on the ratification of the Constitution, so he had to take that out and really intentionally just didn't say anything about slavery. The founding fathers essentially said, oh, we'll deal with that later. So the northern states quickly industrialized, while southern states' climate allowed for huge plantations to be extremely profitable. In the north, there were more extreme weather conditions that didn't allow for as much farming and cash crops, so they moved more to industrialized buildings and factories, and the southern states kept to big old plantations with tobacco and cotton and sugar, and it made it so profitable, especially because they didn't have to pay for labor. So the South's economy depended entirely on this cheap labor and large plantations. So as new states were added to the U.S., both the North and South struggled not to fall behind in the balance of free and slave states. So when Missouri, I believe it was the 14th state added to the U.S., the Missouri Compromise set a line that divided the North and South. So basically, above this line were free states, and below this line were slave states, so that the balance could kind of stay equal. But then, with the addition of Texas, America entered into a war with Spain and ended up gaining lots of Western territory, which led to the Compromise of 1850, where California became free, the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory were free to vote for slavery, and the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. So essentially, any runaway slaves had to be returned back to the southern states, which really made abolitionists angry. So essentially, tensions rose between the North and the South for years in Congress, on the streets, and in the courts. And while Abe Lincoln saw slavery as a moral issue, most strong abolitionists from the North only opposed slavery as an economic threat because the cheap labor in the South kind of threatened the industrialization in the North. So basically, when Abe Lincoln was elected president, many slave states seceded from the Union because they felt that the federal government was no longer representing them. They felt that they weren't going to be heard in the federal government anymore. And so they did what they did in the American Revolution. They thought it would be a great idea to just leave the Union because they weren't being represented. So Abe Lincoln insisted that he would take slaves from the South, but he planned to reverse the successions from the Union. And essentially, two sides formed, the Union and the Confederate, and at Fort Sumter, Confederate soldiers fired at the fort, beginning the Civil War. And throughout the war, it was the bloodiest battle in American history. There were more casualties than the American Revolution, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam, all combined. So by the end of the war, the Union came out the winner, but that did not by any means solidify slaves' rights as people. They continued to face segregation for years and years and years. And that is the Civil War and how it contributed and affected racism in America.